Thanks for inviting me again to this year's Broadband for All, organized by Ericsson in close cooperation with COAI. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thought I'd talk a bit about where we are in the global industry and the fast uptake of technology. Then I'll talk a bit about what this means for policymakers, for governments and regulators, the challenges in taking us into the network society. And then, of course, I'll talk about spectrum, the most important asset that is needed to ensure the way forward and in order for us to deliver these very important services. So just one slide to show that we see a continued rapid uptake of technology. This is showing the number of mobile subscriptions going forward from today's level of some 7.4 billion to more than 9 billion in the next 5 years. But the most significant change is actually that 85% by 2021 of all mobile subscriptions will actually be on 3G and 4G, enabling mobile broadband. And this is, of course, driven by the fast uptake of smartphones around the world, connecting billions to the internet for the first time via the mobile device. And what's happening then with more users out there, with more advanced devices, and we know also and can foresee that each user will actually increase his or her data consumption via the mobile device, be it on a smartphone, a tablet, or a connected PC, by a factor of 4 or 6. And all this brought together makes for this explosion of traffic in mobile networks. And already today, actually video represents more than half of traffic in mobile networks. But actually, by 2021, that number will be over 70%. But of course, it's not only a very fast pace when it comes to connecting people. We know that over history, it took us 100 years to connect 1 billion places, about 25 years to connect 5 billion people. And we expect in a very short time to connect 50 billion things, 50 billion connected devices. We actually expect that by 2021, we'll reach 28 billion or so. And this is actually enabling us to take us into what Ericsson has termed the network society, where basically everything that benefits from being connected to the network will be connected. And this produces and establishes a platform for basically all businesses, for all sectors of society that can use the ICT as a platform and a foundation for innovation. We know this will have a very broad application. We will hear examples here today, but it also has the power to really transform societies. So technology is obviously driving this change. Then you can ask yourself, what is the role then of governments, policymakers? What do they need to do? And I should emphasize that the role of policymakers is actually increasing, because obviously technology cannot do it all alone. There is no automatic results of establishing the benefits of this network society. So increasingly, policymakers will have to produce the adequate response in order for us to decide the size and the sustainability of the benefits following from this development. So what does this mean? We see technology in the blue curve there. I mean, technology has a pace of change that is exponential. Things are happening. We know about Moore's law, etc. This is happening exponentially. We see that people and markets are pretty deft at adapting to this technology change. But we also know, as this sort of straight line there illustrates, that the pace of change when it comes to governance and institutions is very much linear. So the gap has actually been increasing between where technology is and the policy response. So there is a gap that needs to be filled in order for us to reap the full benefits of the network society. And this actually shows that there are a number of challenges that the policymakers need to respond to, because it's important that there is a vision by governments. Where do we want to take us? But the policymakers, the governments, also need to ensure that there are the skills, the incentives are there, the resources are there, and finally, there needs to be an action plan to decide how to take the country further. And we see from our experience studying national broadband plans around the world that if you just fail on one, if you miss out on one of these elements, you are not guaranteed success. So it has to be a response that is sort of holistic from governments in order to address this. And actually, if we look at some countries, you can't read it, but there are actually 15 countries, both emerging markets and more advanced markets, that we looked into, and how they've handled the national broadband plans. And you can see the green marks there showing where you have been successful. And this shows that there's no guarantee that you will succeed if you're in an advanced market, or that you would fail if you're in an emerging market. Actually, the best examples of national broadband policies we find both in countries like my home country in Sweden, or South Korea, or Singapore, but we actually find it in South Africa as well. So there is a possibility, definitely, for also emerging markets to get their act together and produce broadband plans and national digitalization plans that actually work. OECD did a study, mostly advanced OECD countries, but also countries like Egypt. And they see now that out of the countries they looked at a recent study, actually 27 out of 34 countries had a digitalization strategy. And what is so important with that? I think the first point is extremely important. It's not only about broadband deployments. Broadband is absolutely fundamental, but what the governments need to do is to address cross-sectorial issues. It's not only about Department of ICT and Telecoms. All government departments need to be involved. Also, these strategies that we find, they are designed to increase competitiveness, to drive growth, and increase social well-being. So policies and programs need to need to be also complemented by complete and concrete action programs in these countries. So there are many good examples around the world. We've seen that. And the challenge is, of course, that if you're a policymaker, some years back, you could focus probably on what we call the supply side issues. Have your national broadband plan, make sure they have the good network regulation, ensure that you have the spectrum available. But increasingly, you also need to address what we would call the demand side. How do you regulate data usage, data protection? Data is the new oil, as someone has said. Also, media content regulation. The whole Internet of Things that we already talked about, and also embracing the horizontal issues like internet governance, trade issues, intellectual property rights, and not least cybersecurity and critical network security. So the task of regulators has become more important, but I would say also more challenging. Okay, so coming into then to spectrum. And this is maybe a typical country. It's not one particular country, but it shows the spectrum assets of an operator. Lower frequency band, 700, that of course will be opened up and made available next year in India. Mid-range spectrum up to the highest spectrum. What we see now is two trends. One is that LTE, 4G LTE, is gradually initiated and launched in most of these spectrum bands. And the other trend is, of course, that we see much more of carrier aggregation, both in 3G and HSPA, but increasingly also in 4G LTE, and of course delivering then ever higher capacity of these networks. This is the development we're seeing now. This is actually showcasing the median download speeds in LTE networks in 5 countries. So from the top is Australia, then it's Sweden, then it's the United States, and then it's Japan and India. And to be fair, of course, LTE only very recently was introduced in India. This actually tracks back to 2012, up until just a few months ago. And you see that top scorer here is actually Australia. And this is as measured by users themselves that use this speed test. So users are actually initiating this test themselves. But what we see is, of course, that you reach very high speeds in LTE networks in Australia today. And why is that? Well, if you look at the leading operator in Australia, you can see that they have quite a big chunk of spectrum. They have spectrum assets of more than 200 megahertz. And if you remember, Sweden was actually number 2 in that list. If you look at Telia, the leading Swedish operator, they are close to 200. They are at 170 megahertz. And after you see here, Japan, 120 megahertz. Coming back to that slide, you see that Japan did pretty well up until a bit more than a year ago. But then, of course, with increased usage, of course, when users are getting hooked to these new services, they have more subscribers in the networks. If they don't secure more spectrum, you actually see that the median speeds on the red curve there is actually stabilizing and not increasing anymore. So there's a clear link between spectrum availability and the speed of 4G networks that you're able to deliver. So spectrum availability is then critical. This was actually a study that made some time back by GSMA, identifying what they saw as the spectrum shortage by 2020 in a number of Asian countries, estimating between 300 and 600 megahertz per country. I think here enough to say that we see, of course, that India is taking a big step in the right direction by opening up 700 and also other frequency bands next year, working hard to actually fill that gap. But of course, for us in the industry, we looked also at the recently concluded World Radio Conference, the so-called WRC, taking place for 4 weeks in Geneva, where governments around the world come together in order to identify new spectrum, not only for mobile, but also for other industries. And I must say that some weeks back, we had major worries that this conference, which is only taking place every third or fourth year, would not produce the wished for results, namely to secure more spectrum. But in the end, it actually came out in a pretty good way. Difficult for you to see, but actually what happened was that there is now an agreement and identification of globally harmonized spectrum, both in the 1.4 gigahertz band and in the higher band around 3.5 gigahertz. So looking at our sort of expectations only some weeks back, this came out pretty well. And what is also important, especially referring to India here, is that India and some other countries actually took further steps. I mean, in the Indian case, also opening up for mobile services to study that in the below 700 megahertz band in 470 to 694. So steps are taken in the right direction. And just when you are on regulation, of course, what we see is that this convergence of broadcasting and mobile, and also we see, of course, satellite offering similar services to end users as mobile is doing. We see, of course, an increasing need for converged regulation, and in order to create what we would call a level playing field, independent of who is providing similar services. You saw the Ericsson 5G terminal. It's not that handy yet, but I'm sure it will shrink in size when we get closer to the launch date of commercial services 5 years from now. And you also heard Anders Backerholm from the Ericsson studio talking about the vastly increased demands and objectives that we have with delivering and developing 5G when it comes to data volumes, the number of connected devices, the latency, which has to come down dramatically, the response times, the end-user data rates exploding, and of course also from a sustainability point of view, the battery life. And so then coming back to the spectrum, what is the spectrum needed for 5G? We see that, and Anders Backerholm very clearly emphasized that 5G will be in combination with 4G. 4G will be a necessary basis, and then 5G networks will be added on top of that, working together seamlessly, as you saw in the example. And we're then looking at spectrum above 6 gigahertz, and even up to very high frequency bands, where you can secure big bandwidths. And this is quite detailed, but actually what we have been saying is that already at this WRC, it would have been excellent if one had been able to identify the need for studies in the lower part of these high frequency bands between 6 and 10 gigahertz, etc. What actually happened was that there was consensus. Once again, I think it's strong credit to the international community that say that before next World Radio Conference, you need to identify spectrum and start studies in these higher frequency bands. So that's happening, but still I think we need to look at the lower half, the lower part of those higher frequency bands, because if we are to launch 5G, and we, in our latest Ericsson Mobility report, actually saw that there will be around 150 million 5G subscriptions already by 2021. And we need spectrum in order to meet the demands of indoor usage, to penetrate buildings and walls and windows, etc. Use cases will be multiple. I think we will hear more about that. But of course, it will not only be about connecting persons requiring high bandwidth and high performance services, but also about Internet of Things, remote controlled machines, etc., etc., e-health, m-health solutions, etc. But who knows? And just to sum up, spectrum remains of absolutely fundamental importance to the development of these services, and of course the preferred option, as we saw in the results from WRC, is harmonized spectrum, enabling industry to develop the standardized technologies that then can be launched by operators in the licensed frequency bands. This has been proven to be an extremely successful model. We'll continue to build on that. And for the regulators, for the governments, for the policymakers, in order to master this digital transformation taking us into the network society, we need, of course, to secure high-quality broadband and IT infrastructure, but it's also about providing the leadership and the institutional capabilities, as well as delivering the enabling policies and regulation for this to happen, and for us in our societies to reap the full benefits of this technology revolution, 4G and 5G taking us forward. Thank you very much.